Yeah, so my name is David Beito. I'm professor emeritus at the University of Alabama, and I've written a new book called The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights, which I have right here somewhere. There it is. And that's what I'm doing. And I've got other books that I've written on mutual aid and on civil rights history. And I've got a book coming out on Rose Wilder Lane, who some of your listeners might have heard of, who is a daughter of the author of Little House on the Prairie books. And that's going to be coming out really any time now. And that's an edited collection.
In your book, you've made the case that Roosevelt blatantly violated the Bill of Rights, and yet he remains popular among the Americans to this day. Does this demonstrate that evidence, in this case, the evidence that he violated the Constitution does not matter, that people don't care about any of this?
Yeah, to some extent. And the way it's treated in history texts is the following. They basically say, well, Roosevelt was pretty good on the Bill of Rights. In fact, he gave us the four freedoms. There was this one big exception, and that was Japanese
Sorry.
internment. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
that's the way it's treated.
What four freedoms you are referring to?
Oh, freedom, uh, 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 freedom of speech, basically, or freedom of the press, freedom of worship. And then, of course, he slips in these new freedoms: freedom from fear and freedom from want. And he does that in his speech in 1941, pre-World War, basically the Atlanta Charter thing. So he's trying to rework the Bill of Rights. Now, what's interesting about this is, as president, Roosevelt showed very little interest in the Bill of Rights till about the late 30s, when I think he started to um, uh, give the image that he was interested in it. But of course, as I was saying before, the one big exception that historians will all concede is that Roosevelt did something bad, and that is he interned Japanese Americans. He put Japanese Americans into concentration camps during World War II. But the tendency of historians is to say, well, this was an aberration. This was the hysteria of the moment. He had other things on his mind. Everybody was for it. All of those things are sort of not true to a great extent, but it tends to be excused. But it's the worst violation of civil liberties in American history, certainly in, I would say, ever, certainly in modern American history. But yet, if you look at polls of great presidents, FDR tends to be rated number one or number two, sometimes number three, but he's almost always in the top three category. And I think that's going to change eventually, because Woodrow Wilson used to be rated as one of the great presidents. And now he's not as much as he used to be. So it shows that these perceptions can change over time. And I think it will change about Roosevelt, because nobody can defend the Japanese internment now. No one on the left, none of the people that were like Roosevelt will defend it. The only people that will defend it are a few conservatives here and there. So they're vulnerable to criticism, I think, and re-examination.
Okay, the first amendments, the first freedoms you refer to, they're actually the First Amendment, and the First Amendment was enacted by the founding fathers. So how could people actually believe that these freedoms were given by Roosevelt?
I don't know if they believe they were given by them, but Roosevelt successfully. There were very short memories. Here's the story on why Roosevelt starts talking about the Bill of Rights initially. He never was interested in it. He was never part of the civil liberties tradition of progressivism or even the New Deal. There was a mayor of Jersey City, big city political machine named Frank Hague. Hague was a big critic or a kind of a mini dictator, right? You would have people come in like the socialist leader Norman Thomas would try to give a speech, and he would expel them from Jersey City. He made a famous statement. He said, "I am the law," right? So he was kind of a typical dictator, but he was also a very close ally with Franklin D. Roosevelt. He helped Roosevelt at conventions, helped him to win New Jersey, which was a swing state. And in 1938, Roosevelt is under tremendous pressure from civil libertarians in the New Deal who are saying, "Why are you tolerating this Hague guy?" And Roosevelt eventually does not turn on Hague, but he gives some rhetoric that sounds like he really is a defender of the Bill of Rights. He's the champion of the Bill of Rights. And I think people are kind of fooled by that, but he is not a champion of the Bill of Rights at all. But a lot of the people, civil libertarians, are on the political left, so they want to think the best of him. But that's a very good question. How does he get this reputation? And then in 1941, he gives a very famous speech called the Four Freedoms speech, where he says, this is as we go into the war, right, with Nazi Germany, as that's looming, that we're representing these four freedoms. So I think a lot of it's a kind of situational, kind of a propaganda ploy to a great extent, to sort of sell the war, right? And then during the war, he's making this argument, and that reinforces it.
Well, obviously nobody who says I'm the law could be a defender of the Bill of Rights. I'm the law contradicts everything that's in the Bill of Rights, so it's preposterous. Obviously, I keep trying to understand what kind of atmosphere needs to exist in a country so that the president could get away with this. For example, I'm thinking why the Americans' courts were not used to defend used against Roosevelt to defend the freedoms in the Bill of Rights. Why invoking the Bill of Rights was not enough to stop what Roosevelt did in terms of the internment camps, in terms of curbing the freedom of speech and everything else, in terms of the Fourth Amendment, reading private telegrams. You dedicate part of your book to this, the Black Committee and all that. Why quoting the American Constitution was not enough to stop this?
Because I think it's a period of hysteria. It's a period of, well, Roosevelt, let me go back a little bit and sort of disagree in a sense. The courts did push back more than people have acknowledged. For example, the Black Committee, we're referring to the Black Committee, which read millions of private telegrams. Eventually, a court said that was unconstitutional. And it provided an impediment to later investigations. If you look at people in the Justice Department, a lot of them have been educated at law schools by professors who had very bad memories of World War I. World War I was considered a disaster in terms of civil liberties. So there is a lot of resistance to Roosevelt from the legal profession, including from his own attorney general. His own attorney general was against Japanese internment. Now, he ended up carrying it out under Roosevelt's orders. His own FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, was against Japanese internment. So there are people pushing back. And I think if these people had not pushed back, that it would have been much, much worse than it could have been otherwise. How does Roosevelt get away with this? Well, Roosevelt is a very charming guy. He has a lot of charisma. He's very good at deniability. So often the people that are committing violations of the Bill of Rights, he can kind of say, well, that really isn't my fault. He's very good at that. Roosevelt is a master politician. And I think that that has a lot to do with it. He's not like Trump, right? Trump will go after people. He'll say, oh, that person is, whatever. He'll criticize them. He'll make up nicknames about them. Roosevelt takes in his rhetoric, he avoids personal attacks. He uses flowery rhetoric that really is quite empty in a lot of ways, but that you can't really object to quite effectively. So we've never had a politician like that in American history who is so effective. Also, Roosevelt controls the radio. We have an agency in this country, the Federal Communications Commission, and Roosevelt is able to use that plus other methods to basically force dissenting voices off the big networks. The big networks are where people get their news. But by 1938, there is not a single commentator on the big networks who is anti-Roosevelt. He's able to get control of radio, essentially. So he has the news in his corner, except for newspapers who are often criticizing Roosevelt, but newspapers, fewer people are getting their news from newspapers. They're getting it from radio. So that is a lot of it. He's able to control that media almost completely. And that is the media that is growing in importance during this time, radio.
So Roosevelt, as far as I understand you, is a wolf in sheep's clothing.
In some ways, but I think that if you look at what his philosophy is, Roosevelt has a philosophy that he expresses privately, which is the important thing is to get the job done. Don't worry about procedure. He is what you could call, I would call an ends-oriented person. The important thing is the end. And Roosevelt is a big government person, right? He believes, I think sincerely, that government needs to do more, that the market has failed, that we need more in the way of central planning. Now, of course, Roosevelt is focused on Roosevelt. He wants to get reelected. He's pragmatic. During World War II, for example, he puts all of these New Dealers in charge of the war effort. But they're so incompetent that he eventually has to force them out and put business people in charge of the war effort, because even he recognizes that it's just going to fail unless you put people that know how to run things in charge. So he's got pragmatism, but he's also got ideology. But he's not into the Bill of Rights. He's not into procedures. He's not into due process. He won't say that publicly, but privately he said many times, isn't it important that we need this, that we need this program? Don't worry so much about how we get it or this particular policy.
Well,
that is a consistent theme with Roosevelt.
There's the justification of every dictator, that the end justifies the mean, that the important thing is to get things done, that procedures just waste time and all that. It's not anything. I mean, all dictators and all jerks in history, really, they are hard but fair. It's always this reoccurring theme. I mean,
well, he comes out of progressivism.
For example, nowadays plays with this as well.
Yeah, I that is a similarity, and I think he gets a lot of this from certain aspects of progressivism. Roosevelt's two big influences, if there were two big influences, were his cousin Theodore Roosevelt. He called him Uncle Ted, even though he was like a fifth cousin, and then his boss during World War I, Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson and Roosevelt did not like each other. But Roosevelt is influenced, Franklin Roosevelt is influenced by both of these men. And there is a strain of progressivism, comes from a guy named Herbert Crowley and others, who basically make that argument. They said, look, we're the modern Jeffersonians. What do they mean by that? We believe in equality. We believe in democracy. However, Alexander Hamilton, we don't like his aristocratic views, but we agree with Hamilton that you don't worry so much about how you do it. Hamilton was very much into don't worry about the constitutional restrictions, get the job done. So what Crowley said is we've brought together Jefferson. Of course, you can debate that, right? But that's how he said it. And Hamilton, right? We've got virtuous means, democracy, or virtuous ends, and our means are Hamiltonian to achieve that end. So it's an interesting melding together. And I would say that I would see Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, in those terms. Now, he's not a great intellectual, right? He didn't read a lot of books. He liked to read detective novels, right? He's not an intellectual, but I think that these ideas are out there, and I think he picks them up, certain ideas like that.
Given how Roosevelt blatantly violated the American Constitution and got away with it, interning so many people without any due process, not to mention
many of them American citizens.
Yes, you mentioned something outrageous that even Japanese children from orphanages were actually interned just because they by their origin was Japanese. I mean, obviously they were not the enemy. But anyway, given that Roosevelt got away with it and remained popular, what does this tell us about how important the Bill of Rights is? In particular, can the Americans rest assured that the Bill of Rights is there to guarantee their rights? If it's
the answer is no, but I will say, and this maybe is more discouraging and encouraging. I see a lot of civil liberties heroes who are defending the Bill of Rights during this time. One of them is the leading socialist in the United States, Norman Thomas. He's like the
but they all
and so forth. They're pushing back. I do not see that today, so that's more discouraging. There were a lot of people on the left that pushed back against Roosevelt. Unfortunately, there are not people on the left now who are upholding civil liberties to the same extent. And if I were to say, is there hope? I would say build coalitions, try to rebuild these coalitions between right and left for the Bill of Rights. Now, it's becoming very difficult. It's very discouraging, but I'm not sure what else to do. Because people do at least give lip service to the Bill of Rights. That's something that is a good thing. They will give lip service to it. Even if they violate it, they'll try to come up with some sort of rationalization. So it can be a very powerful weapon. Still, it has a certain popular sway. And I don't know what else you can do except pull it out and use it for that purpose. Just say, well, just look at it. I mean, it's very explicit what the restrictions are on government.
I grew up in the People's Republic of Bulgaria under socialism, and Roosevelt was always praised by the commies.
He was praised.
He was praised, yes. He was portrayed always in a good light. You could, by the way, watch this even in some of the Soviet movies at the time when Stalin was still in power, obviously. And it's very suspicious to me when the commies praise you.
Well, partly, during World War II at Yalta, now there's an argument that would it be difficult for him to have done anything else politically, but he basically tells Stalin that Eastern Europe, including Bulgaria, is his sphere of influence, right? So in that sense, Roosevelt is sort of the author of communist control to some extent of Eastern Europe, or at least, let's put it this way, Roosevelt basically told Stalin, that's your area. We're not going to do anything. And Roosevelt really did trust Stalin. He thought very highly of it. He was rather, I think, naive about Stalin, but he did. He would he would quote the Soviet Constitution and says, "Well, the Soviet Constitution has freedom of religion," and it does, right? It says it, and he would say things like that. We can work with him. Called him Uncle Joe. Called him Uncle Joe. So there, I think that the Bulgarian communist authorities might be remembering that as well. That Roosevelt was somebody that was rather naive in how he dealt with Stalin
Oh,
and rather trusting of Stalin.
The Bulgarian communist authorities were just following the guidelines of Moscow. They never had thoughts of their own. They just followed the Soviet lead. Bulgaria was, for all practical purposes, a part of the Soviet Union in anything but name. Now, this brings me to his political legacy. Obviously, people associate Roosevelt with ending the Great Depression. This myth has been debunked by many authors, Thomas Sowell among them, Thomas Woods is another that comes to mind. So they have made the case that Roosevelt actually didn't end the Great Depression, he prolonged it. And this brings me to what you keep repeating, that Roosevelt thought that the end justifies the means. So what was the end, given that he made the Great Depression worse?
Well, he's a true believer in a lot of ways.
He believed that he's making things better.
Yeah, or it will be better, right? Just stick at it. I mean, I think a lot of what he believed. He wants a permanent transformation as well. The New Deal is promoted initially as temporary, but it's very clear from an early stage, Roosevelt sees this as going beyond the New Deal. We bring in the Social Security program. We bring in things like rural electrification. We bring in labor union regulations. All of these stayed, and Roosevelt intended them to stay. So he's got a long vision, right? Is he concerned about the Great Depression? Well, he wants to get reelected. He certainly wants the Depression to end, but I think his focus is more on the long term. We need to transform the relationship between the individual and the state. Government is beneficial. The market is chaotic. The market is unplanned, dominated by selfish people. Of course, there's an irony there because I think Roosevelt's pretty selfish in his own way. But we need government to step in. And, well, okay, maybe we won't get out of the Depression right away, but the ideas are still good ones, and we want to transform the society in the long term.
Okay, let's move to his foreign policy legacy. I'll quote here so that I don't get the quote incorrectly. So what Harry S. Truman said before United States got involved in the Second World War. If we see that Germany is winning the war, we ought to help Russia, and if that Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and in that way, let them kill as many as possible. Roosevelt obviously was not president at the time. He was just a senator, if I remember correctly. Now, the public assumes that Roosevelt defeated National Socialism, but recent studies begin to paint a very different picture. I already quoted Truman, and what Truman said at the time seems more and more accurate with time, because his thought has aged very well. Recently, even the European Parliament issued a resolution stating that the USSR was no less to blame for the outbreak of World War II than National Socialist Germany. And I'm not quoting this because EU Parliament is a learned institution, but it's a sign that this is becoming the convention of wisdom. That's what's interesting there. And then there is the growing literature demonstrated that USSR prepared to invade Europe in 1941. And then there is the fact that USSR exterminated about 3 times more people than Nazi Germany, and so on and so forth. In fact, all this proves that Truman was spot on when he said what he said. And yet...
Spot on in what sense? That it is the interest of the US to support one side or the other, depending on who's winning?
That it is in the interest of USA to make sure that both totalitarian monsters kill each other. Because
and that was especially as a very popular view once you had the Stalin-Hitler pact. People use the term common Nazi. I mean,
yes,
at that point, they come very close to a formal alliance. I think Stalin wanted a formal alliance.
They actually formed an alliance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Yeah, it was a non-aggression pact, but I think Stalin wanted to join the Axis. He actually wanted to become part of the Axis.
It was also a pact for dividing Europe, and in particular Poland.
Yeah.
They decided, and they both invaded Poland, although many people today remember only Germany invading Poland.
Well, the Soviets were very smart in the way they handled that because they held off. The Germans did the invasion, and they waited around.
Yeah, again, the Soviets were a wolf in sheep's clothing. But the thing is that Roosevelt didn't follow this sensible policy to make sure that both monsters kill each other and exhaust each other as possible. He helped only one of the monsters, which meant that when the war ended, the remaining monster, the Soviet Union, was powerful enough to threaten the West and to start the Cold War. And in this sense, could we say that Vietnam and the Korean War and the Cold War in general is part of the political legacy of Roosevelt?
Yeah, I think you could say that. Of course, Roosevelt does not succeed. Roosevelt wants to get in World War II. His focus is on the North Atlantic, right? His focus is on Nazi Germany. And this is well documented. There is an effort in the North Atlantic that he's making to create an incident or build up an incident in the North Atlantic that will lead to war with Germany. So his main focus, Roosevelt's main focus, is Germany. But of course, we end up getting in the war because Japan attacks. But if you look at Roosevelt's speeches in 1940, 39, he rarely talks about Japan. I've actually listened to all of Roosevelt's speeches. Japan is a sideshow. It is not a focus. But once Japan attacks, this creates, and then Hitler declares war, which was not a smart move on his part. It opens the door to a true two-front war.
Yes, that was not a smart move on Hitler's part, but let's not forget why Hitler declared war, because United States was already helping the enemies of Hitler. And so Hitler thought that this will just give him a free hand to do more in the Atlantic. But again...
Well, I will say this. If Hitler had not declared war, what would have happened? Because the U.S. knew he wasn't going to declare war. And so that was this is what I've heard anyway. I'm trying to review because my book is not on American foreign policy, so I've got to think about this.
I'm sorry,
but I believe that it was well known that from intelligence sources that Hitler was not going to declare war. Otherwise, if Hitler, that Hitler was going to declare war was known. If it was known that Hitler was not going to declare war, I think there's a very good chance the U.S. would have made a joint declaration, right? Because the focus was very much on getting in war against Germany. So it would have happened anyway. I think there would have been more opposition to it. I think a lot of people in Congress would have said, well, Germany didn't attack us, Japan did. I think Roosevelt, though, would have still gotten, if he'd have asked for a joint declaration of war, in December 8th, he would have gotten it. But it would have been more of a fight for him.
Yeah, but again, my question is, was it good for the interests of the United States and in the West in general that Roosevelt favored the Soviet Union and didn't follow the wise advice of Truman? Because again, Roosevelt helped the Soviet Union, so he made sure that Nazi Germany will be defeated sooner, that the Soviet Union will come out of the war relatively unscathed and intact, and will be able to threaten United States for decades during the Cold War. So was this a smart move on part of Roosevelt? This is
if we're going to do counterfactuals, I would sort of like to take it back a bit. I think Roosevelt, it was positively criminal the way Roosevelt refused to provide, failed to provide a refuge for refugees, Jewish refugees, for specifically. I think a lot could have been done to have provided a refuge for those refugees. So I would sort of move it to that and say, look, if only he had have done that, we would have saved a lot of people, because you had people killed in the death camps. Roosevelt could have prevented that by giving refuge to those refugees. So I would take it back to that level myself. I would sort of prefer to put it in those terms, because I think at that point we have, this is one of the main justifications given for the war. Of course, it's somewhat after the fact, because this didn't start to get emphasized till about the 1940s, 1950s. We could have prevented the Holocaust, and we didn't prevent it. And the way it could have been prevented is if Roosevelt had given refuge to Jewish refugees. And he had every opportunity to do it, not only in the United States, but in third countries. But instead, he was turning away ships like the SS St. Louis. A ship full of Jewish refugees was sent back, and some of the people on it perished in the death camps. So that's the emphasis I would like to do, rather than plot myself in a time machine back to when it's sort of too late to do anything.
Okay, back to my time machine. What about the death camps of the Soviet Union? The fact that the Soviet Union managed, thanks to some extent, thanks to the American aid, allowed the Soviet Union to survive and to murder many more millions after the war. And not only that, but to help the establishment of communism in China and in Korea and in other places. And these are the problems we still have to deal with now in the 21st century. So I'm getting back to this part of the Roosevelt legacy. The Cold War, the fact that Roosevelt ensured that the Soviet Union, one of the two totalitarian monsters, will come out of the war relatively powerful. I like what Truman, because there were two views. This is why I started by quoting Truman. Truman was the view that is supported by what we know now. And then there was Roosevelt, who was in power and who ensured that Nazi Germany will be defeated, but the Soviet Union will survive. And the Soviet, you're talking about the Holocaust, but this Holocaust is about 6 million people, and in the Soviet Union, they were exterminating tens of millions. So as much as the Nazi Holocaust was horrible, the Soviet Holocaust was worse. And thanks to Roosevelt, tens of millions of people were exterminated first in the Soviet Union after the war, and then in China and other places. What about this part of the Roosevelt's legacy?
Well, he certainly was very trusting of Stalin. You know, that's an interesting question. I Again, I would prefer, all right, let's say we had done what I suggested we do. I think it would be a lot easier to do that. But there was something particular about what Hitler was doing that I think, I don't know if I would call it uniquely evil, but it was targeting people solely because of their background, their ethnic background,
Well, excuse me.
and killing them in
Excuse me.
gas chambers. I
I'm
think that
so
could have all been prevented. And
okay.
that is
Okay.
where I would
Okay.
rather put the
Please
focus.
give me a second. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but so
Yeah.
was Stalin. Stalin, for example, murdered 7 million Ukrainians, which is a
Yes.
comparable number, and they were murdered because they were Ukrainians. And then Stalin was murdering many others, like a big chunk of the Chechen people, something I don't remember on top of my head, but a big percentage of the Chechen population was murdered or murdered by Stalin. He was murdering Koreans. He was murdering many other nationalities simply because they belonged to a certain nationality. And even if that was not the case, still, a human being is a human being. Whether you murder a human being because this human being belongs to a certain nationality, or because this human being has said a political joke, or because this human being has been born by wealthy peasants or something along those lines, it's still a murder. So, and Stalin was murdering way more people than Hitler. So why then Roosevelt had to favor Stalin, given that Stalin was worse than Hitler? Hitler was horrible, but Stalin was worse. This is my point. And yet Roosevelt was favoring Stalin. Roosevelt
Well,
was
we
not
could get
following
into
the
a
advice
debate
of
about
anyone.
who was worse because, I mean, again, what you're doing with the Holocaust is you're targeting people solely, you're targeting an entire race, right? And
Well, I say it's worse
yeah,
because 62 is more than 21 mathematically.
yes, that's
And
true.
these are the numbers that Professor Rodolph Rummel gives in his works like Death by Government and Never Again and the others. So in all credible sources tell us the Soviet Union itself admitted of 42 million people exterminated. So the Soviet Union didn't admit of 62, it admitted of 42, but it's still a number twice as large as the calculations of how many people the Nazis were murdering. So the numbers are very clear. Stalin was a bigger murderer than Hitler, and
All
this
right.
book
If
makes
we
him
do your
worse.
strategy, okay, if we do your strategy of always, first of all, I don't know how we would have done that exactly, but of always supporting the weaker side. Um, who is the weaker side as of December 7th, 1941?
Well, the weaker side,
I suppose you could say at that point, well, I don't know. Who is the weaker side at that point?
the
I
weaker
don't know if
side,
you can do that kind of calculation effectively.
the weaker side in 1941 was the Soviet Union, and the weaker side
Yes.
in 1944 was Nazi Germany. So we were talking about these two views: the Roosevelt view just help one of the sides of the conflict, and the Truman view, which was make sure that they exhaust each other.
The trouble with that is I don't know how that would possibly work in terms of American foreign policy. Has the US ever pursued a official policy of, okay, we figured out Nazis are losing now, so we'll help them, or the Soviets are losing now? And also, it's somewhat debatable about who was winning in December 1941. Uh, you could say the Battle of Britain was over, had not been a success. The Soviet Union or Nazi Germany was starting to get bogged down a bit in the Soviet Union. So I don't see that it would be possible politically to do that, and even possible in an objective sense. Who's winning the war now between Iraq or between Ukraine and Russia? Somewhat disputable, right?
Well, it's not
Ukrainians have
that.
attacked Russia, but then again, they're losing on their front in the Donbass. So you could make an argument either way, I suppose.
If I may, I don't think it's so unclear. I think that Russia is winning because Russia has taken out a big chunk of Ukraine and it's keeping it.
I think you're right, but it's lasting an awfully long time. And I know a lot of people last year were predicting that it was going to all be over with by the end of the year. 1 year later, it's still going. I think Russia is winning, but I don't think it's an easy fight. It's dragging on a lot longer than I expected it to drag on. I think they will eventually win, but a lot of people will die in the meantime. And that's an issue too, right? You have a war that just goes on and people being, like World War I, a lot of people just dying on both sides. That's not a pretty picture either.
Well, looking back, I don't know how clear that was at the time, but looking back, it seems clear enough. Once Germany could not win in 1914, once the Battle of Mons, when they tried to take over Paris, the miracle of Mons, or maybe I'm not pronouncing it right. But once this failed, it was very clear who will win, because the war became a war of attrition, and in a war of attrition, whoever has more resources win. So from 1914 and 1918, everything was just more casualties, more resources wasted, but the outcome was a certainty, because it was Germany with limited resources against the British Empire, the French Empire, and Russia, and eventually.
Yeah, but they knocked Russia out. So at that point, it was looking up
they
for
knocked
Germany.
it out only years later, when the United States was already joining the war. And clearly,
right in the middle of it. Yes.
And clearly, the Central Powers didn't have the resources for a prolonged war of attrition. So my point is, the outcome was clear from this point of view in 1914, once the Schlieffen Plan failed. But I get what you're saying, that it's impossible for a politician in the United States or any other democratic country, maybe it's possible for the Soviet politician, but not in a democratic country, to say today, Germany is horrible, we should help the Soviet Union, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, say, oh, actually, the Soviet Union is horrible, we should help Germany, although we helped the Soviet Union until yesterday. Obviously, that's very, very hard to explain to the voters.
We did it in a little bit with the Iran-Iraq war, but even that really wasn't. I mean, that was sort of, there was the philosophy there of that a lot of American policymakers had. Let's just let them fight it out, right? Let's let them kill each other. But, it wasn't really an official policy.
Would you like to share with us your future projects, what you are working on right now?
Well, I'm working actually on a biography of Roosevelt, but I'm not to World War II yet. I'm in the 1930s. So I'm going back and I'm doing a full-scale study of him. I have a book coming out on Roswalder Lane. Lane was the daughter of the author of the Little House on the Prairie books, and she was a libertarian. And during World War II, she wrote for a black newspaper in the United States, the leading black newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier. Those are two projects I'm sort of working on at this point. I'm working on a kind of a podcast series about a town in the United States, Mississippi, called Mount Bayou, which was a black controlled town during the Jim Crow era. And that is another project. So I'm keeping pretty busy between all of these projects. But the one that's going to be out very, very soon is the one about Lane, who was really kind of the founder of the modern libertarian movement in a lot of ways. Well, that's exaggeration, but she apparently coined the term libertarian to apply to people of kind of free market views. Anarchists had used it before that, but she kind of reformulated it.
I didn't know that. I consider myself a libertarian. I always argue that less government involvement is always better.
Yeah.
And yet, well, not always, admittedly. No, I'm not so clear of a libertarian, but I had no idea who had coined the term I'm using so often.
Yeah, that's according to a lot of theories. And she's there in the 1940s and the 1950s with Mises and, all of these people working with them in various, she had a little thing called the Freedom School that she funded. So she was very much a key figure in early libertarianism. Of course, if you look at libertarianism in 1946, you're talking about very, very few people in the United States. It was pretty much almost a dead movement by that time.
Yeah, especially after the New Deal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The New Deal was what people always want to hear, that a government big enough to give you everything will not take everything from you. You will just
now,
get.
what is your this is you're interviewing me, but what is your work about when history and other plans?
It is 12 stories, no musings, no theory, no abstractions, 12 stories with verifiable facts that are sourced, where what was achieved was the exact opposite of what was intended. The exact opposite. So
you had a rich target environment there. A lot of examples.
Yes, we could have easily made it 24 stories, but we decided that there is no point to repeat certain things that have been well explained and documented so many times, like the prohibition. The prohibition intended to lower the crime, and yet it increased the crime. The exact opposite of what was intended. So we made some compromises. For example, the minimum wage laws that are supposed to increase the income of the poor, and they actually lower the income of the poor. And we made these compromises because it turns out that after so many books are written on the subject, people still don't get it somehow, yet it's so obvious. And we tried with different examples. Maybe this will help. But mostly we focused on stories that are less known around World War II, because they're less known in the West, because most of the new literature on the subject is coming in Russian, and most of it is still not translated into English. Only a few books are translated. And it turns out the history of World War II, this part that was between Germany and the Soviet Union, was radically different from what we have been taught so many times.
Well, I think there was still talk of a separate peace, that there was a fear that Roosevelt had, and that others in the administration is that, even in, say, 1943, that Stalin and Hitler would make up and come back together again.
Well, not in 1943, because by 1943, the problem for the Soviet Union were already over. But in 1941, yes, there is indication that the Soviet Union was so desperate that the Soviet Union wanted a separate peace, yes. But it's way more interesting than that. I remember when I saw a book back in the 90s, The Liberator by Viktor Suvorov, about World War II, and my reaction was, come on. I mean, World War II, we already know everything. Thousands of books, so many documentaries, so many video footage, so many of everything. Some of the people who participated are still around. We know everything. What is there? What is the point of wasting any more paper? And then open the book, and I'm glad that I did, because I was blown away. And what blew me away was not so much that I learned something new factually, because most of the facts there were actually known. I already knew them. But what blew me away, that I have never seen how all these facts have a very simple explanation. All of a sudden, all these loose ends have a very simple explanation of what actually went on in 1941 between Germany and the Soviet Union. And then there were more books by other authors. So the literature on this is growing. There were, after Viktor Suvorov, there were Mark Solonin and Sokolov and Beshanov. But again, all of this is available mostly in Russian. I speak Russian, the Western public doesn't. So it's not that I'm saying anything new scientifically with this book. Oh, it's here. I'm always confused where it is.
You got it.
But it's new for those who don't speak Russian. And also there are other stories that sound improbable, and yet when you go into the details, they look very simple and obvious.
Well, you know, I didn't even want to write a chapter on Japanese internment because I told my publisher, Independent Institute, I said, everybody knows about that. But he said, no, you have to do it. So I did. And I found out a lot of new stuff about it.
I'm very glad that you did.
I wasn't, I was sort of aware of, but, Roosevelt in his executive order does not use the term Japanese one time. And nobody's telling me why. Why did he do that? He talks about people that must be removed, all other people. So, that's one example. But, things that have been written about so much, because there's a vast literature on Japanese internment, but a lot of aspects of that just haven't been adequately discussed because they weren't priorities, I guess, for people that wrote these books.
I'm very glad you wrote this book. Because I thought that, again, that there is nothing new to be said on this subject. And yet when I went through your book, unfortunately, I haven't read it in full by now, but I skim read it. And there was so much that I didn't know. For example, I had no idea that Roosevelt has stifled the free speech, effectively the free speech, when it came to the radio. I knew that in Hollywood at the time there was the Hague Code and the censorship, but I had no idea that there has been effectively a censorship, unofficial censorship, when it comes to the radio waves in the United States. That was a shock to me, because for me, United States is still this shining, what was the expression in English? Shining...
the city upon a hill?
Yes.
City on a hill?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was shocked that it has been so easy actually for Roosevelt to stifle free speech. I didn't know this. I knew about the internments, but I didn't know this aspect and also.
And you see, it's like a puzzle. It all fits together. I say that the Japanese internment is a big part of the puzzle, big piece, but it's still one puzzle. So you see how. And once I looked at that, I could say, oh, this is connected to this. This is connected to this. The same people are here that were saying the same thing on this other issue related to civil liberties. So it's worthwhile not to view it in isolation. And a lot of people do. That's the way people view Black history in the United States, for example. They tend to view it in isolation. I always try to avoid that. Because once you do, you start to see the interconnections.
For me, the most shocking thing, the most puzzling thing of the puzzle you talk about was how little the United States Constitution meant at the time. Because I'm a fan of this, you probably haven't heard of this movement, First Amendment Auditors. So I'm watching these First Amendment videos on YouTube, where ordinary people with a camera try to test whether the First Amendment is observed. So they go to some government institution, they begin to film people there, Eventually, the police is called. Everybody is annoyed. And what will happen actually? It turns out that the police began years ago to arrest those people. They're being arrested less and less because they're winning in the courts. So in the courts, they invoke the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. And this is what I kept thinking when I was browsing through your book. How the hell this was going on? And given that the Bill of Rights is so clear, the First Amendment is so clear, the Fourth Amendment is so clear, how it was possible, why nobody used the courts, and you say that the courts were used, but effectively the people were kept without being sentenced to imprisonment, without any due course of law. They were kept in these internment camps. So apparently the Bill of Rights meant nothing. And this was the most shocking thing when I kept reading your book. And it was not just Roosevelt doing this, but Roosevelt did many other things. Yeah. And yet he remains popular. This reminds me of Churchill, because Churchill, I guess, is our Roosevelt. I'm a British citizen. And Churchill, nobody else has done so much for the destruction of the British Empire as Churchill. I don't know whether you're familiar with Pat Buchanan's book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. He made the case there, and I fully agree. And the more literature comes in Russian, the more it actually supports what he asserted so many years ago. And yet, Churchill remains so popular. Whenever I try to say something against Churchill here in Britain, they take me as a lunatic.
Yeah, but aren't there a lot of people from India and the UK? I would think that they would have more of a perhaps Palestinians, perhaps more of a negative assessment of Churchill.
Yeah, but also some conservatives like Patrick Buchanan,
yeah,
have a dim view of Churchill, and for good reason. I mean, these people were so harmful, Churchill, Roosevelt, to their own countries, not to mention to the whole world, and yet they are still icons.
I think Roosevelt is vulnerable, and just writing about Roosevelt. But if Roosevelt goes down, who's going to be left? Who's going to be he is a hero to
Truman.
The left.
Truman.
What?
Truman.
Truman is, he's not a hero to the left in the same way.
Well, he's a hero to me.
Well, Truman was against Japanese internment. Did you know that?
Now, no, I didn't know this, but I would expect this.
No. He was interviewed years ago, and he said, that was a terrible thing he did, Roosevelt. I was against it at the time. Now, of course, I looked at the U.S. Senate debates at the time. Nobody spoke up, including Truman. But, I take him at his word. People just privately opposed it. You know what Truman said about Roosevelt? He said he was the coldest man he ever met. The cold, and that fits. Roosevelt is a very cold and calculating man. There's a veneer of charm. He's not a likable guy. I mean, he's sadistic. He's amoral. And I don't like the atomic bomb. I don't think that was good. But I think Truman was somebody that was a human being, that often had sort of common sense. And I've listened to all of, you might be interested in this. The Truman Library is these interviews that were done with Truman, hours and hours, because he was, someone was going to write a book about him. It never happened, but they interviewed him for hours and they asked him about everything. They asked him about President Polk and President Washington, and it was just exhaustive. It was very interesting. And I had a new respect for Truman listening to all of this, I have to say.
Well, same here. Thank you very much. Please tell us where one can buy your book.
Well, you can go to Independent Institute if you want to patronize them directly, independent.org, or you can get it on Amazon. And it's going to be coming out in paperback as well, but it's still pretty cheap. It's hardcover. It's I think it's $21, something like that. Pretty good price, but it will be coming out in paperback as well.
When?
And I invite people who disagree with what I've said to read it, because I really want to get a dialogue going with people in the profession. But people that tend to invite me tend to be more libertarian, conservative, and I would love to, to engage with people that like Roosevelt, but they don't seem interested, even
Of course not.
using me as a foil, using me as a straw man or whatever. I don't know.
Of course not. You say all the wrong things.
You have the same experiences?
I have experience under socialism, and I immigrated to the West because the West is not the East. So I'm a culture immigrant, not an economic immigrant. And I'm worried and I'm pleasantly surprised that the West increasingly begins to resemble the socialist East of my childhood and my teenage years, when people were saying one thing in private, another thing in public. This is, obviously the West is still free. Obviously there is freedom of speech. Obviously there is rule of law, etc. Mostly, but increasingly there is this contrast between what people say in public and in private, and this was very characteristic of socialism. In socialism, we used to say one thing between ourselves and totally different things when strangers were present who could report you.
Well, that's why I'm very worried about things that, nobody's condemning the censorship of Twitter in Brazil, for example. If Musk is pushed out, we're going to go back to that kind of thing.
Okay, what about the censorship of Twitter in Britain, in my country? Obviously it's not as bad as in Brazil, I guess, but Britain is not supposed to be as bad as Brazil.
So the British are able to enforce their own laws on Twitter? Well, is this at the EU?
No, it's not. It's not about forcing any laws on Twitter. It's about covering people to be careful what they post on Twitter. But the fact that I can still say this and feel safe, this means that there's still freedom of speech in Britain. However, there are certain things that could get you in trouble. There are many people arrested for what they posted on Twitter.
Yeah.
People who would have never been arrested in the United States. Actually, I heard of a few cases in the United States, but there were very few, and these cases ended up with large settlements where the American government had to pay a lot of compensation and nobody was jailed. This is not the situation in Britain, and this is a very shocking development, given that Britain was the country that invented freedom, that the founding fathers were actually British.
Well, that is one good thing about the First Amendment, and maybe it isn't observed, but it's something that people can appeal to.
We don't have it.
And they don't have it in Canada either, at least not the same tradition of the First Amendment. So it is still a very powerful thing. It still can be used to good effect, but it's discouraging where we're going. So anyway, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm glad we finally got together. Sorry for all the technical problems. I don't know if that was on my end or not.
Probably on our end. Okay.
Oh, by the way, your co-author is the name of a character in a TV show, an old TV show my wife and I are watching, called Peyton Place. I don't know if she's ever heard of her, but her name was Allison McKenzie.
Okay, she's right behind me, and she says
Has
yes.
she ever heard of that?
Yes, I have actually. Yes.
I bet you others have very old, probably a lot of very old people have told you that, right? Like me.
Yeah. No, my grandparents told me about that. That's probably maybe why I was named that name. They used to joke
Oh,
about
that
it
was a
was
hot
named
character
after.
at the time, all over the tabloids and everything. Yeah.
And this was the early 1970s, mid 70s.
No, 1960s.
Oh, 60s, yeah. I probably was named after her then. Yeah.
Okay. Well, still fresh memory. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Beito. See you
Bye.
later. Bye.
Let's be in touch.